You can't just take everything. This is my house.
The environmental judgment is final, sir. We are seizing the property immediately.
It is collateral now.
He thought stealing a few gallons of my antique leaded racing fuel was a harmless prank. He thought wrong. By the time I was done, that $50 worth of gas had cost him his $400,000 house, his prized dirt bike, and his entire future. I didn't lay a finger on him. I just let the EPA do the dirty work. My name is Gene, and I'm 71 years old, but I'm far from helpless. I spent 40 years of my life as a master mechanic, and another 20 moonlighting on the amateur racing circuit. I know cars, I know engines, and I certainly know chemistry. I know, for instance, that the 1970 muscle car sitting in my garage, my pride and joy, my true retirement companion, needs a very specific kind of highly toxic fuel to run correctly. That's why I have a legitimate, legal stockpile of $110 octane leaded racing gasoline, kept locked up and clearly labeled as a hazardous material. It's an expensive relic, and an absolute necessity for my classic engine, which was built long before catalytic converters and emission standards ruined the fun. If you enjoy hearing stories about entitled jerks getting the karmic justice they deserve through carefully planned, completely legal revenge, you should hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. The problem started 6 months ago, right after Jason, the 20-something entitled punk next door, moved in. Jason was exactly the type of neighbor you dread. Loud music, constant trash in the yard, and a serious arrogance problem. His most treasured possession was a heavily modified sport dirt bike, one of those loud monsters that tears up the asphalt and violates every sound ordinance in the county. It was expensive, custom-built, and crucially, had a high-compression engine that he'd clearly modified to run on premium fuel. He was constantly bragging on his social media about how he'd ripped out the catalytic converter and bypassed the oxygen sensors for maximum performance. This fact would later become the key to his downfall, but at the time, it was just an annoyance. One morning, I went out to the garage and noticed the fuel level in my storage drum was noticeably low. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, a leak. But upon closer inspection, I found tiny, telltale droplets on the concrete, leading from the drum and stopping exactly at the property line. Then I saw it, a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the padlock. Someone was siphoning my leaded gasoline. I knew instantly it was Jason. Who else in a quiet suburban neighborhood would need $110 per gallon fuel? A quick look at his bike and the faint but distinct smell of high-octane fuel hanging in his garage confirmed my suspicion. He wasn't just stealing fuel. He was stealing poison and dumping it into an engine that was chemically incompatible with it. His smug disregard for private property, combined with his mechanical ignorance, sealed his fate. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I wouldn't call the police. They would handle a simple theft, but I wanted something bigger. I wanted him to lose everything he valued, including the bike, the house he inherited, and his towering ego. And I knew the EPA held a much heavier, much more satisfying legal hammer than the local cops. This was going to be a clean, precise, and financially ruinous execution, and I was going to be the silent conductor. My initial reaction to finding the traces of the theft was a familiar, hot flash of anger. But that quickly gave way to a cold, calculating resolve. I'd seen too many young punks skate by on simple theft charges. Calling the police would result in a slap on the wrist, a wasted afternoon of paperwork, and maybe, just maybe, an order for Jason to pay me back for a couple of gallons of gas. That wasn't justice. That was an inconvenience. My plan required patience, strategic thinking, and, most importantly, irrefutable evidence of a far greater crime. I needed Jason to escalate. I needed him to cross a line that wasn't just about stealing my property, but about flagrantly breaking federal law. The confrontation came 2 days later. I waited until I saw him fiddling with his dirt bike in his driveway, revving that ear-splitting machine. I walked over, my manner deliberately calm. I said, my voice steady. He froze, his hand dropping from the throttle. For a split second, I saw a flicker of guilt, but it vanished instantly, replaced by a wall of obnoxious confidence. He straightened up, crossed his arms, and gave me a smirk that made my blood run cold. He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. He leaned in conspiratorially, his eyes glinting with disrespect. He then delivered the line that cemented his downfall. He punctuated his insult by poking me lightly on the chest with a grease-stained finger. 5, he snorted. 6. That arrogant laugh was the sound of his fate being sealed. He wasn't just stealing, he was mocking me, banking on my age and the perceived insignificance of the theft to make me back down. By openly admitting he didn't have a catalytic converter, a required emission control device, and showing zero respect for the law or his neighbors, he had given me all the ammunition I needed. He had handed me the keys to his $400,000 disaster. I simply nodded, maintaining a deadpan expression. I turned and walked away. He probably thought I was defeated, a feeble old man, scared off by his aggression. But as I walked back, a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. He had called the EPA's power into question, and I knew exactly how wrong he was. The battle had just shifted from a petty neighborhood dispute to a sophisticated legal maneuver, and Jason, the mechanically ignorant thief, was utterly unprepared for the silent war he had just declared. My next step had to be quiet, precise, and purely observational. The verbal confrontation was over. The physical evidence collection was about to begin. After that arrogant confrontation, I retired to my workshop, not to rage, but to calculate. Jason's disrespect was the match, but my decades of mechanical knowledge were the dynamite. He had made 2 critical, law-breaking errors that were perfectly leveraged by my antique fuel. First, stealing a hazardous, regulated substance, and second, admitting to tampering with his bike's emission control system. I knew the devastating truth that Jason, in his youth and haste for performance, completely overlooked. Modern engines, even modified ones, are built to run only on unleaded fuel. The catalytic converter, which he boasted about removing, is designed to clean up exhaust gases. But the oxygen sensors, those little electronic sentinels that manage the engine's air-fuel ratio, are still present, and they are incredibly sensitive. Leaded gasoline, even a few tanks of it, doesn't just damage these components. The lead compounds poison them. They become coated, rendering them useless and sending bad data to the bike's computer. This leads to the engine running rich, burning hotter, and eventually suffering severe, expensive damage. Jason was filling his prized possession with a slow-acting, high-octane toxin. But technical knowledge wasn't enough. I needed rock-solid proof. Legal revenge requires evidence, not just suspicion. I went online and ordered a tiny, high-definition security camera disguised as a simple piece of landscaping decor. It was waterproof, battery-powered, and had motion detection with a perfect view of my garage door and the adjacent driveway. This wasn't about catching him stealing the gas, a misdemeanor at best. This was about legally documenting the act of him pouring the regulated, leaded fuel into the tank of his road-going, unleaded-only motorcycle. The EPA doesn't need to catch you mid-siphon. They just need proof that you contaminated a non-compliant vehicle. The camera arrived 2 days later. That evening, under the cover of dusk, I carefully mounted it in a bush that had been growing on my property for years, adjusting the lens until I had a crisp, clear shot of the path Jason took when he snuck across the lawn. I even tested it, taking a gallon of water and pouring it into a jerry can by the property line. The footage was perfect, clear, time-stamped, and undeniable. The final piece of the setup was the bait. I replaced the cheap padlock I had before with a brand-new, expensive, high-security lock, but I deliberately left it unlocked. I positioned the fuel drum so it was just slightly easier to access. I didn't want him to struggle. I wanted him to be confident, to feel entitled, and to feed his machine this toxic blend quickly and repeatedly. I was setting a perfectly engineered trap, and the bait was the very thing he desperately craved. As I surveyed the scene from my porch that night, sipping a glass of iced tea, I felt the satisfying calm of the predator. Jason had been given every opportunity to stop, and instead, he chose hubris. Now, the clock was ticking, not on my patience, but on the viability of his expensive engine, and, more critically, on his financial future. The game was simple. Let him steal enough poison to guarantee the engine damage, and let the camera record enough proof to guarantee the maximum possible fine. With the camera rolling and the bait set, the next crucial step was to confirm the full weight of the legal consequences. I needed to know exactly how heavy the axe would fall. This wasn't just about a fine. This was about ensuring the punishment fit the crime of arrogance and theft. And that meant involving the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. I didn't call the EPA hotline directly. That would be too suspicious and too slow. Instead, I called an old colleague named Frank. Frank and I had raced together decades ago, and after he retired from the circuit, he went into government compliance work, specifically with emissions and vehicle standards for the state, often liaising with the federal EPA. I kept the conversation completely hypothetical, framing it as a professional curiosity. "Hey, Frank," I said casually. "I was talking to a buddy, and a crazy hypothetical came up. Say some moron has a modern, road-going vehicle, like a new dirt bike with a modified engine, and they decide to run it purely on leaded racing fuel. And let's say this same genius also boasted about removing the catalytic converter. What kind of trouble would this hypothetical guy be in?" Frank laughed, a deep, knowing rumble. "Gene, you haven't changed. Always thinking about horsepower and trouble. That's not just trouble, that's a federal crime with a capital F. You're talking about 2 major violations." He explained the details, and the numbers were staggering. First, fuel misfueling. Running a vehicle designed for unleaded fuel on leaded fuel is a serious violation. This is about protecting public health from lead emissions. The fines start high, often thousands of dollars per instance. Second, the tampering violation. Removing or modifying emission control devices, like the catalytic converter, on a federally certified vehicle is where the EPA truly gets aggressive. Frank explained that the fines for tampering can be up to $4,527 per day that the vehicle is operated in a tampered condition. He stressed that they don't just fine the mechanic, they fine the owner. But then came the kicker, the detail that made my revenge truly feasible. Frank continued, lowering his voice. I thanked Frank, telling him his hypothetical information was fascinating, and hung up. I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, a sense of cold power washing over me. Jason wasn't just facing a police report. He was facing a federal financial judgment that could easily exceed the value of his entire house. The $50 worth of stolen fuel was the fuse, and the EPA was the atomic bomb. All I had to do now was wait for the thief to continue feeding the engine poison, documenting his voluntary criminal act until the damage was both physical and legally undeniable. The trap was sprung, and the pressure was building. With the legal implications confirmed and the camera securely recording, my revenge shifted into its most satisfying phase, the waiting game. I had deliberately made the fuel drum accessible, leaving the new high-security lock unlocked and slightly ajar. I was essentially hanging a neon sign over my expensive vintage fuel, daring the thief to take more. Jason didn't disappoint. He started stealing with greater frequency. Before, it was once a week. Now, emboldened by my apparent submission and the easy access, he was making trips every few nights. I didn't have to watch in person. The camera's motion detector alerted me, and I would later review the crisp, undeniable footage. There he was, sometimes with a friend, laughing and joking as he ran the siphon hose from my barrel into his jerry can. He was so confident in his entitlement that he didn't even bother waiting until the dead of night anymore. He was practically daring me to catch him. What was deeply satisfying was the knowledge that every gallon he stole was not just a loss of property for me, but a compounding chemical disaster for him. He believed he was boosting his performance, getting a premium edge over other riders. In reality, the high-lead fuel was coating his expensive oxygen sensors, corrupting the data flowing to his engine control unit, and slowly suffocating his high-performance motor. I started noticing small changes in his routine. I'd hear him start his bike, and the smooth, aggressive roar was now punctuated by a slight hesitation, a little rough idle that wasn't there before. The exhaust fumes, already obnoxious due to the missing catalytic converter, now had a distinct, acrid smell, the unmistakable odor of lead fouling the works. He'd spend longer revving the bike in his driveway, trying to tune out the strange new coughs and sputtering, visibly frustrated. He started complaining loudly on his phone to his friends, blaming the performance issues on, quote, 13 or, quote, 14, never once connecting the dots back to his, quote, 15 fuel source. He was chasing symptom after symptom, completely blind to the root cause, the lead that was essentially destroying his engine's intelligence. My inner mechanic reveled in the precise, slow destruction. It was an intellectual revenge. I didn't need to damage the bike physically. The chemistry of the leaded fuel, combined with his illegal engine modifications, was handling the execution with elegant simplicity. Every time I watched the video feed of him stealing, I felt a detached, cool excitement. He was willingly committing the necessary crime to ensure his own total destruction. He was meticulously gathering the evidence against himself, one toxic gallon at a time. The tension was building, not in a fight, but in the inevitable engine failure that was drawing closer with every ride. My cold waiting game began to yield visible physical results. About 3 weeks had passed, and Jason had siphoned enough leaded fuel to thoroughly saturate his engine with toxins. Lead is a cumulative poison for modern mechanics. It doesn't destroy instantly. It builds up, fouling delicate sensors and turning them into useless, dirty hunks of metal. The first signs were subtle to a layman, but to my experienced ear, they were crystal clear. When Jason started his bike in the mornings, he now had to crank the ignition longer than before. There was a distinct stutter at idle, that uneven rhythm that clearly signals the oxygen sensors are feeding corrupted data back to the engine's computer. The engine simply didn't know how much fuel it needed anymore. I even watched Jason try to fix it. He bought a new set of spark plugs, changed his oil, but it did nothing. He was only wasting money, trying to diagnose a problem that his own arrogance and thievery had created. He was chasing symptoms, oblivious to the fact that he was the poisoner. One evening, I observed from my window as he talked to his friend, desperately trying to get the bike to run smoothly. The engine finally caught, but the exhaust was now pumping out a thick, blackish smoke with a sharp, unpleasant odor, the unmistakable smell of lead fouling the workings. I heard his friend yell across the yard. Jason was visibly frustrated. This exchange was perfect. Not only was he clueless about my involvement, but he was actively misdiagnosing his own impending disaster. He was attributing the chemical destruction to a standard mechanical fault. He was about to take it to a mechanic who would likely tell him the problems were severe but wouldn't or couldn't trace the root cause back to lead contamination without a full, specialized engine breakdown, something rarely done. Every ride he took now carried a double threat. He continued to physically destroy his bike, and, more importantly, he continued to emit lead into the atmosphere. This was the perfect environmental transgression. I didn't rush. The longer he operated the bike in this condition, the higher the fine became for daily operation of a vehicle with a compromised emission system. The clock on his financial collapse was ticking louder and louder. Jason didn't listen to his friend, and he certainly didn't heed the bike's obvious distress signals. Arrogance rarely allows for self-reflection. Instead of seeking a qualified mechanic who might have spotted the lead contamination, he simply kept trying to power through the issues, convinced it was a simple tune-up problem. This was exactly what I needed. Every kilometer he rode was another piece of evidence, another nail in his financial coffin, driven by the EPA's penalty structure. The real drama unfolded late one Friday afternoon. I was in my garage, polishing the chrome on my muscle car, when I heard the bike start up. It sounded worse than ever, a grinding, wheezing noise punctuated by violent backfires. Jason was gearing up for a big weekend ride, probably heading up to the hills where he liked to show off. I checked my hidden camera feed. He was topping off his tank one last time before leaving, pouring in the last of the toxic, high-octane mix. He slapped the tank and gunned the throttle, revving the bike to its limit. The black smoke billowing out of the tailpipe was thick enough to make me cough, even from my garage. The air smelled burnt, oily, and distinctly metallic. About an hour later, I got the call I was waiting for. Not from Jason, but from the town's police dispatcher. They were calling about an, quote, 19. Apparently, Jason hadn't made it more than 10 miles before his prized machine gave up the ghost on the side of a busy highway entrance ramp. I drove past the scene, pretending to be heading to the hardware store. It was chaos. Jason was screaming into his phone, standing next to his bike, which was tilted precariously on the shoulder. There were dark scorch marks on the asphalt beneath the engine block. The bike was dead, completely and utterly seized. Later, the official tow report confirmed the severity. The engine had run so hot, thanks to the wildly incorrect air-fuel mixture caused by the poisoned sensors, that critical internal components had melted and fused together. His expensive, custom-built engine was now a ruined paperweight. The look on Jason's face was a mixture of blind rage and despair. He wasn't just upset, he was emotionally shattered. That bike was his identity, his pride, and his most valuable possession besides the house. Now it was totaled, and the initial estimates for a full engine replacement were astronomical, more than he could possibly afford. He spent the rest of the weekend sulking and shouting, trying to blame the bike manufacturer, the tow truck driver, and even the local gas station for bad fuel. He remained completely oblivious that the cause was entirely self-inflicted, poured directly from my drum. The engine failure was the physical culmination of my plan. Now, it was time for the legal phase. The physical damage guaranteed his attention. The federal prosecution would guarantee his ruin. I downloaded all the video evidence from the hidden camera, watching Jason's last act of theft one more time. The time for observation was over. The time for decisive action had arrived. The mechanical breakdown of Jason's bike was merely the opening act. The real, satisfying vengeance was the financial and legal blow I was about to deliver. I had a mountain of evidence, and I was ready to use it. I spent an entire evening meticulously compiling the Jason dossier. I wasn't going to submit a sloppy, anonymous tip. This was going to be a professionally presented case that the EPA couldn't ignore. First, I downloaded all the relevant footage from the hidden camera. I created short, clearly labeled video clips. 1. Jason stealing leaded fuel. First instance. Date, time. 2. Jason refueling dirt bike with leaded gas. Third instance. Date, time. 3. Last refueling before failure. Date, time. Each clip clearly showed him siphoning fuel from my labeled drum and pouring it directly into his modified motorcycle tank. The timestamps were irrefutable. Second, I gathered the supporting circumstantial evidence. This was the truly damning part. Jason was active on social media, constantly posting pictures of his prized bike. It took me a few minutes to find his public profile, where he had posted a series of photos detailing his performance upgrades. One picture, captioned, "Weight reduction for speed, bye-bye cat," showed him proudly holding the severed catalytic converter from his bike's exhaust system. This single post provided an explicit, documented admission of a federal tampering violation. I printed high-resolution copies of these photos, highlighting the captions. Finally, I wrote the accompanying letter. It was anonymous and purely factual. I didn't mention the theft. That was a petty crime for the police. I focused solely on the environmental violations. The documented use of prohibited leaded fuel in a street-legal vehicle, and the owner's self-admitted removal of the required emission control device, the catalytic converter, citing his public social media post as proof. I calculated that the daily fines, combined with the misfueling penalties over the weeks he had been operating the bike, would easily top $50,000. I chose the method of delivery carefully. Instead of emailing, which could be traced, I drove to a post office 20 miles away in a neighboring town and sent the complete package via registered mail to the regional EPA enforcement office. This guaranteed the package would reach the right desk and require a signature, meaning it couldn't be ignored. After dropping the package, I felt an extraordinary sense of calm. The hardest part was over. I had built a perfect trap using chemistry and legal statutes, and the thief had eagerly walked into it, documenting his own demise every step of the way. I knew the wheels of federal bureaucracy turn slowly, but when they finally start moving, they are unstoppable. The moment of culmination, the final, devastating impact, was now only a matter of time. Weeks passed in agonizing silence. Jason was miserable. His bike was still sitting at the mechanic's shop, declared, quote, 27, quote, due to the catastrophic internal failure, and he was sinking money into futile attempts at repair, refusing to accept the severity of the problem. He was riding his bicycle to work, a stark come-down from his loud, modified machine. Then, the federal machinery finally rumbled to life. I was watering my lawn when the official-looking black sedan, unmarked but clearly government, pulled up to Jason's house. Two grim-faced people in suits emerged, carrying thick briefcases. They were EPA enforcement agents. They didn't waste time. They knocked, and when Jason answered, I watched the confrontation unfold from behind my hedge, maintaining a perfect air of neighborly detachment. The agents were not there to negotiate. They handed Jason a thick packet of documents, which I knew contained the official Notice of Violation, NOV. Jason's face went from annoyance to sheer white panic as he read the first few pages. I could only hear snippets of the conversation, but they were enough. Violation of the Clean Air Act, Section 203, one agent stated flatly. Tampering with an emission control system, the catalytic converter, the other added, and documented use of leaded gasoline in a non-compliant vehicle. We have video evidence, Mr. Smith, showing you pouring the fuel directly into the tank. Jason exploded. Video? That gas was stolen. I was just using up some old... Wait, who filmed that? The agent simply held up one of my printed social media screenshots. This photo, posted by you on Date, shows the removed converter. The theft of the fuel is a police matter. The environmental contamination is a federal violation. Then came the climax. The main agent stated the amount, and it was a figure that echoed down the quiet street like a gunshot. The total assessed fine for willful and repeated violations, including daily operation of a tampered vehicle, is currently $87,500. You have 30 days to pay in full, or we will place a federal lien on all assets, starting with this property. Jason stumbled back, his face ashen. $87,000. That amount wasn't just steep. It was impossible for a young man with a minimum wage job and a dead bike. He tried to argue, beg, and blame, but the agents were professionals. They didn't care about his sob story. They cared about the law and the precedent. They simply handed him a final deadline and walked back to their car, leaving Jason trembling on his porch, holding the death warrant for his financial stability. 2 weeks later, the silence on Jason's property was absolute. He was gone, having accepted a quick low-ball offer on the house just to satisfy the looming federal lien and avoid total bankruptcy. The sign went up quietly, "For sale, as is." I watched the moving van pull away, taking the disgraced young man and his totaled bike with it. The neighborhood was instantly quieter, the air cleaner, and my own sense of peace was completely restored. I didn't cheer, I didn't gloat. I just felt the cool, profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. The moving truck disappeared, and the immediate, profound silence that descended on the neighborhood was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. Jason's house now sits vacant, a clean slate, waiting for a neighbor who respects property and understands the weight of federal law. My vengeance was complete, and it wasn't dirty, cruel, or illegal. It was intelligent, precise, and financially surgical. I hadn't actively destroyed Jason's life. He had done that himself by making a series of arrogant, criminal choices. I simply ensured he faced the full, non-negotiable consequences of those choices. I protected myself, my property, and my peace using the law he mocked. I took his insult, the physical intrusion, and the environmental crime, and I leveraged them into the perfect, legally sanctioned comeback. Now, I spend my days back in my garage, focused entirely on the things that bring me joy. My muscle car's engine purrs sweetly with the very fuel Jason thought he could steal with impunity. The antique fuel drum is still there, but now it's secured with a new, stronger lock, and I monitor it religiously. Not because I fear a new thief, but because the ritual reminds me of the hard-won peace. I am thriving in the quiet, enjoying my retirement, and appreciating the simple justice of a well-executed plan. I learned that the best defense isn't a bigger fist. It's superior knowledge and endless patience. Jason lost his house and his bike over a few gallons of gas because he confused my quiet demeanor with weakness. That mistake cost him absolutely everything he valued. I've told you my whole story, start to finish, the physical ruin and the financial ruin. Now, I have to ask you, after everything Jason did, the theft, the disrespect, the pollution, do you think I did the right thing, or would you have handled this differently in my place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story of sweet, legal revenge satisfying, make sure you hit that like button right now. And please, subscribe so you don't miss any more true stories of karma payback, and entitled jerks getting exactly what they deserve. The end. Thank you for listening.